Hi, my name's Alexander Hamilton, and I'm the top dog in the Federalist Party. You might think it's George Washington, but he's just a pup. I'm the top dog. Why? Well, I came up with the financial plan. It was pretty good. Helped, get the full financial faith and credit of the U.S. government going. Well, it's 1796, and I want to run for president. Hmm. Oh, I had the National Bank, and it was really unpopular with the Democratic Republicans. Oh, and then I had an affair with Maria Reynolds. That made me unpopular with everybody. Guess I can't run for president.
This is APUS History. We are continuing with our online assignments, and today's topic is going to be both foreign and domestic affairs that are taking place during the Adams administration. John Adams is elected in 1796, and he serves from 1797 to 1801. So John Adams, again, is first elected in 1796. Now, if we talk about the election of 1796, first of all, obviously George Washington had been president for the previous 2 terms, and there were a lot of people that wanted him to continue as president, but he decided that after 2 terms he was going to be done. Um, this is when he gives his farewell address, which actually wasn't an address, it was simply a letter, and it was published in newspapers around the country. But it was meant to be given to the American people, let them know why he was leaving. And in it, he also warned about a couple of issues that he thought were important. Number one was warning against political differences, especially political parties. And the other was permanent alliances. He was okay with short-term or economic alliances with other countries, but he was fearful of permanent or long-term alliances. So anything that would have been a foreign entanglement or something that could draw the U.S. in, he would have been somewhat fearful of. So 1796, George Washington fades out of the picture, and so we have a new election for president in 1796. Now, George Washington had pretty much stayed above the political divisions that had emerged. Nobody was really attacking George Washington the same way that other people might have attacked the other political party back and forth. So for the first time, we really have a partisan political battle in this election. Now, um, for the Democratic Republicans, their leader is Thomas Jefferson. It was obvious that he was going to be the nominee for the Democratic Republicans, and so Thomas Jefferson is going to run for president on that side. On the other side, it wasn't quite as clear. Now, George Washington had been president, but during that time, Alexander Hamilton had still been the leader of the Federalist Party. So it might make sense that Alexander Hamilton would run, but he had created a lot of enemies during his time as Secretary of the Treasury and also in other roles and other actions that he had. So since Alexander Hamilton has created a situation basically where it's going to be very difficult for him to win the election, the Federalists instead nominate John Adams, who was the vice president under Washington, to run for president. So in the election of 1796, it's very close. It's John Adams, the Federalist, versus Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. John Adams would win, but because of the way the Electoral College worked at that time, it gave the person with the most votes the presidency and the person with the second most votes the vice presidency. It was a complicated system that they actually had to fix later on because you could obviously figure out the problems with that. But John Adams becomes president, and then Thomas Jefferson becomes vice president. So as we move into 1797, John Adams is indeed the president now. As we get into the Adams administration, if we remember from earlier, because of the Jay Treaty that had occurred with Great Britain, and there was also the Pinckney Treaty that happened with Spain as well, but it's mainly the Jay Treaty because France and Britain are rivals, and once we have the Jay Treaty with Britain, our relationship with Britain improves, but at the same time it causes our relationship with France to deteriorate. They started seizing our ships, And obviously this is not something that the U.S. could let continue indefinitely. So John Adams sends a delegation of Americans to go to France and negotiate a new treaty or something to try to resolve this problem of them seizing our ships. So when the American delegation arrives, the French demand a huge loan and a large bribe as well before any talks could even take place. Now, bribes like this were actually fairly common in diplomacy. However, it was extremely offensive to the Americans. It offended John Adams very much that the French were, insulting them, basically demanding a bribe before they would even negotiate. And so the Americans simply refused to do this. When Adams finds out about it, he goes and informs Congress, and in doing so, he doesn't actually call the French messengers by their actual names. He instead calls them messengers X, Y, and Z. And so this whole issue becomes known as the XYZ affair. The result of it is it creates a lot of anti-French mood, to some extent hysteria in the U.S. There's a lot of anger towards the French. Americans stop trading with the French to some extent. The U.S. begins to build up its navy. We actually did seize some French ships in retaliation, although it wasn't nearly as many as the French seized American ships. And this would be something that's sometimes known as the quasi-war or the undeclared naval war. And it's mainly limited to the oceans. It's happening on the seas with both sides seizing each other's ships. So it's not an actual declared war, but there was certainly hostility back and forth between the French and the Americans. Now, a lot of people, especially Federalists, were calling for war with France. Now, John Adams, as a Federalist, it would have been easy for him to go along with this, but he doesn't. He keeps a level head. He sends another peace delegation to France, and eventually they are able to work out a treaty that would improve the relationship between both countries. Now, this is particularly true after Napoleon comes to power in 1800. However, this really hurts John Adams' standing among the Federalists because, again, they wanted to go to war with France, but he keeps a cool head, and the U.S. does not go to war. Things calm down, and our relationship with France does indeed improve. Now, during this time period, when there was a significant amount of criticism of both John Adams and the Adams administration in general, two acts are going to be passed by Congress, and Adams would go ahead and sign these, making them law, which, looking back, would be very controversial, and some people would say that they were actually unconstitutional. Now, no court ever ruled on them or anything, but if you look at what the Constitution says, it seems pretty clear that they were indeed unconstitutional. But again, no court ever ruled on them. They were simply controversial at that time, and what they were, there was the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. And the reason these were passed was to silence and stop opposition to the Federalists and stop the movement of voters to the Democratic Republican Party. Now, if we look first at the Alien Act, it placed new restrictions on foreigners becoming citizens of the United States. It made the time period which they had to wait before they could become citizens much longer. And as a result, many foreigners actually ended up leaving the country. This also had a big impact because many foreigners who came over typically were poor, might have gone into farming, and this was the base population for the Democratic Republicans. So it ended up kind of slowing down the number of new voters for the Democratic Republican Party. On the other hand, there was the Sedition Act. Sedition is basically speaking out against the government. And so what this is doing is saying that anyone who speaks out against the government, the Adams administration, John Adams, is committing a crime, committing sedition, and they can go to jail for that. And the unconstitutional part seems clear that, according to the First Amendment, you have the freedom of speech, and there's also the freedom of the press. But this is limiting that because it's saying that you don't have the right to criticize the government. So this was extremely controversial, and it was pretty much a black mark on the Adams administration. So it made a lot of Democratic Republicans angry, but again, it is something that's going to be in place throughout the Adams administration. Now, with the Alien and Sedition Acts being passed, it created a huge amount of anger and outrage among Democratic Republicans because they felt this was not having anything to do with national security. This had everything to do with the Federalists trying to target, silence, and stifle any type of movement towards the Democratic Republican Party. And that was very true. That's what part of the Alien and Sedition Acts were for. It was intended to target the Democratic Republicans, even though the Federalists probably wouldn't admit it. The problem is there's nothing the Democratic Republicans can do. If we remember back, Washington had been the first president, and now Adams is the president. They're both Federalists. So the executive branch is controlled by Federalists. The judicial branch of government, judges and justices get appointed by the president. Well, the president was a Federalist with both Adams and Washington. So all of the judges are Federalists. So the judicial branch of government is controlled by Federalists. Well, Congress, so the House and the Senate, that was made up of a majority of Federalists. So the entire federal government is controlled by the Federalist Party. So there's nothing Democratic Republicans can do to stop or to try to overturn the Alien and Sedition Acts. So they do the next best thing in their opinion, and that is to use the state governments. And that makes sense because, if you remember, the Democratic Republicans tended to favor state governments as opposed to the federal government anyway. So what the Democratic Republicans do is that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they secretly write these resolutions that would end up being approved by both the Virginia and the Kentucky state legislatures, and thus they get the names the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions state that an individual state has the right to nullify acts of the federal government that that particular state disagrees with. So it's advocating something known as nullification. Now, nullification is not going to be actually legitimate, but it's something that the states are trying here. They're trying to see if they can do this. Now, why are the Democratic Republicans trying to do this? Because they don't have any other way to protest. They can't protest at the national level because they don't control the federal government. So they're trying to get the state legislatures to try to overturn something of the federal government. Now, because only Virginia and only Kentucky end up approving these, it doesn't really go much further than that. But it is putting this idea out there of nullification. So these two acts, they don't really accomplish anything in the long term other than bringing up nullification and setting up what would be a very, very fierce election in the year 1800. All right, well, this is the end of what we are covering today. So if you have any questions, please post comments on Facebook, or you're more than welcome to email me. And you can close things off with maybe a laugh or two. So, all right, that's it.
Hi, my name's Alexander Hamilton. I'm the top dog in the Federalist Party. Stop jumping. Sit. Hi, I'm Alexander Hamilton. I'm the top dog in the Federalist Party. Oh, I'm checking something out.